I usually don't like grim, serious movies. I deal with enough reality in my life. I don't want to spend my time and my good money to see more of the same of it on screen. So when I saw previews for the movie The Revenant and learned that it starred Leonardo DiCaprio, I'm not a big fan, I thought, no thanks. But then the reviews started coming in, and the buzz around the movie was so positive, and I generally like period piece stories, so I started to get intrigued. And then when I heard that in this movie Leonardo DiCaprio gets mauled by a bear, I thought, well, I can go see that. That might be fun. The movie surprised me on one count. DiCaprio really does a magnificent job of acting in this movie. But there was no surprise about the intensity of the film. It's 2 hours of gruesome. How many of you have seen The Revenant? Okay, a few of you have. Well, for those of you who haven't seen it, the story takes place in 1823 when a man named Hugh Glass works as a guide for a party of trappers in what is today North and South Dakota. While Glass and his son Hawk are off hunting, the trappers' camp is ambushed by a war party of Arikara Native Americans. Glass and Hawk rush back to the camp, but the fight is already lost. The trappers who survived the attack are forced to flee and abandon the beaver pelts that they had collected to sell when they got home. After they regroup down the river, Glass stumbles upon a mother grizzly bear protecting her cubs, who viciously attacks him, leaving him near death. The leader of the trappers offers money for anybody who will stay behind with Glass in case he recovers or if he dies, to give him a decent burial. His son Hawk agrees, of course, and so does a young man named Jim Bridger and another man named John Fitzgerald, whom we already know by this time in the movie. He's the scuzzbag of the film. And sure enough, after everyone else is gone, Fitzgerald murders Hawk right in front of his father, who's powerless to do or say anything. And then he convinces Bridger that the war party is close by, and so the two of them dump Glass in a shallow grave and run away. Most of the remainder of the film is Hugh Glass's stubborn refusal to die. The hardships he endures are monumental and heartbreaking. You wonder how in the world anybody could survive his wounds, much less trek across hundreds of miles in search of Fitzgerald. If you have a weak stomach, don't go see this movie. Parts of it are downright repugnant. But despite every obstacle imaginable, Glass perseveres, because it's not just his will to endure. It's also his roiling search for revenge. And it's only fair, right? I mean, there are always consequences to our actions, right? When people get away with reprehensible deeds, that's not justice, is it? A lady in a previous church I served had been married to a policeman who was working on a drug case, and the drug kingpin decided he was tired of this cop getting too close to his operation, so he hired a woman to pretend she was having car trouble on a lonely road, and when the policeman stopped to help her, a hired gun jumped out of the woods and murdered him in cold blood. The drug lord eventually wound up in jail on a different charge, and the hired gun was killed by somebody else, but the woman decoy was found and arrested. I sat in on part of that trial, and I tried to be as helpful as I could to the widow and her large extended family. But despite the prosecutor's best efforts, the woman decoy was found not guilty. I still remember the visceral revulsion I felt when I heard the verdict. I still remember sitting with the widow while she cried and said, maybe there'll be justice in the next life. I can't blame her for wanting those lowlifes to pay for what they did to her and her family. I can't blame Hugh Glass for wanting Fitzgerald to pay for what he did to his son and to him. Somebody ought to pay. When I was in college, my journalism professor would often come in and tell somebody to go off to a certain place and find him a story. And one day he came in and said to me to go down to the county courthouse, sit in on some trials and write them up as newspaper stories. So I wandered into a courtroom where a guy was on trial for shooting his girlfriend in the face. Now, he must have been a pretty poor shot because the girlfriend was in the courtroom and she didn't look much the worse for wear. But justice is justice, so the trial proceeded. The first witness called to the stand was the girlfriend. After about 10 minutes of questioning, she mentioned something in passing about a date she had had with a defendant just a few weeks earlier. And the judge interrupted, wait. Do you mean to tell me that you went out on a date with this man after he shot you in the face? She said, that's right. I still remember him leaning over the bench and saying, what would it take to get you out of my courtroom? And she said, well, I just want him to pay my doctor bills. And the gavel came down, wham, pay this woman's doctor bills, and both of you get out of here. Justice is a beautiful thing. So when Cain murders Abel, in today's story from Genesis 4, we cheer God on as He dispenses justice. God says, when you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You'll be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And we say, attaboy, God, keep it up, let him have it. And Cain moans, well, anyone who meets me may kill me. And we say, well, you should have thought of that before you murdered your own brother, you weasel-eyed sinner, you. But then comes the curveball. The text says the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. In other words, even on the heels of Cain's horrendous sin, there is still grace. The mark of Cain announces his guilt, yes, for nothing can change the past, and there are always consequences to our actions, but the mark also identifies Cain as one protected by God. Is that justice? Not if you define justice as someone getting his or her comeuppance. Usually it's the other person getting his or her comeuppance, not me, of course. By Hugh Glass' definition of justice and by our definition of justice, Abel's murder doesn't receive justice. Cain gets a bye. If Hugh Glass had told the crucifixion story, Jesus would have come down from the cross and turned the soldiers and the crowd around him into dog food. Jesus would have confronted his disciples on Easter Sunday and said, you deserted me in my hour of need, now I'm going to desert you. See how you like it. He would have said to Peter, deny me 3 times, will you? Well, now stand up and take your lumps like a man. But we know that's not what happened. Jesus looked at those soldiers who had pinioned him to the cross and the crowd jeering around him, and he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. He told the women at the empty tomb, go tell my disciples, and especially Peter, I'll see him in Galilee. Instead of vengeance, he offered forgiveness. You see, folks, the Bible's definition of justice is not our definition of justice. We usually think of justice as retributive, that is, somebody has to be punished for a wrong done. But the Bible isn't as interested in retributive justice as it is in distributive justice. A fair distribution of all things that sustain life and make it meaningful. Why does Fitzgerald murder Hawk and leave Glass to die? It's because he fears he will lose the money that he's earned trapping pelts. So he will do whatever is necessary to get and keep what he needs. But what if that motivation was taken away? What if Fitzgerald no longer has to worry about that? Would he still act like a jerk? Maybe. Maybe not. It's at least an open question. Now, please don't hear me belittling what happened to Glass, or what happened to the woman whose husband had been killed, or what happened to Abel in Genesis 4, or what happened to Jesus on the cross. By no stretch of the imagination can anyone claim those actions should not have consequences. All I'm saying is that those of us who claim to be followers of Jesus should have the radical courage to work for the kind of justice Jesus wanted. Not retributive justice, but distributive justice. I'm not claiming forgiveness is easy. Forgiveness may be the hardest actions we human beings ever pull off. And I'm certainly not saying we should just forget atrocities like the mass murder last Sunday in Orlando. I'm just thinking it's time for us in the church to start approaching these things from a different side. Instead of asking who should get punished, maybe we should ask, who should receive the love of God through us? And the answer, of course, is everybody. Of course, you're sitting there thinking, it'll never work, Paris. Maybe. Maybe even at my age, I'm still incredibly naive. And yet I ask you this. Does retributive justice have a stellar track record in our world? When Glass finally confronts Fitzgerald at the end of The Revenant and they beat each other to a pulp, and then Glass stands by while the Arikara Indian War Party scalps Fitzgerald and kills him, is the world suddenly a better place? I don't think so. By the way, the word revenant refers to one who returns supposedly from the dead. And when someone wounds me, I want a Hugh Glass kind of revenant to show up and dispense justice. But when I wound somebody else, I want a Jesus kind of revenant to show up and dispense justice. Problem is, I can't have it both ways, and neither can you. So given the choice between a life that's fair and a life of grace, I'll choose the life of grace every time. Some of you may remember the story about an 87-year-old man by the name of Carl. Quiet man, big smile, firm handshake, walked with a slight limp from a bullet wound he got in World War II. Carl had lived in the same uptown neighborhood for 50 years, even as the neighborhood began to change and drug-infested gangs began to multiply. Well, one day Carl noticed a flyer posted at his church asking for volunteers to care for the garden behind the parsonage, and so Carl signed up and went to work. One afternoon, Carl was in the garden watering when three young toughs in gang clothing approached him. They surrounded him and glared at him, obviously trying to intimidate him and scare him. But Carl simply looked at them and asked, "It's hot today. Would any of you like a drink from the hose?" And the tallest and fiercest looking of the three, a man with tattoos running down both arms, smiled malevolently and said, "Yeah, sure." And as Carl tried to hand him the hose, the other two grabbed Carl by the arms and threw him to the ground. And while the hose snaked across the grass, dousing everything in its way, the three assailants stole Carl's retirement watch and his wallet and dashed off down the street. Well, the minister happened to be home, and he saw the attack from the kitchen window, but it was over so fast he couldn't get out there before the gang members had run away. He gasped, Carl, are you okay? Are you hurt?" And Carl sat up and sort of shook his head, said, yeah, I'm all right. Just some punk kids. Hope they'll wise up one day." With that, he hoisted himself to his feet and picked up the hose. The minister said, "Carl, what are you doing?" And he says, "Preacher, I got to finish my watering. It's been pretty dry lately." few weeks later, the same 3 gang members showed up again. Again, they tried to intimidate Carl. Again, Carl said, "Would you like a drink from the hose?" But this time they didn't rob him. They just wrenched the hose from his hands and drenched him from head to foot in icy water. And when they'd finished humiliating him, they ambled down the street shouting catcalls and curses and laughing at what they had just done. Carl turned toward the warm sun, picked up his hose, and went back to his watering. As summer began easing into fall, Carl was in the garden one day when he heard someone walk up behind him, and it startled him, and he stumbled and fell into some evergreen branches, and just then he saw an all too familiar tattooed arm reach down to him. He braced himself for the expected attack, but the young man said, "Don't worry, old man, I'm not going to hurt you this time." And he helped Carl to his feet and held out a crumpled paper bag. Carl said, "What's this?" The young man said, "It's your stuff. I got your watch out of the pawn shop, and I replaced the money in your wallet." Carl said, I don't understand. The young man shifted his feet, looking kind of embarrassed. He said, "I learned something from you. I ran with that gang and hurt people like you. We picked on you because you were old and we knew we could get away with it. But every time we picked on you, instead of yelling and fighting back, you tried to give us a drink of water. You didn't hate us for hating you. You kept showing love against our hate. I couldn't sleep after I stole your stuff. So here it is back. This bag is my way of saying thanks for straightening me out, I guess." And with that, he walked away. Carl opened the bag and took out his retirement watch and put it on, and then he opened his wallet and checked to make sure that his wedding photo from years ago was still there, and it was. Carl died one cold day after Christmas. And among the crowd of people who attended the funeral, the minister noticed a tall, tattooed young man sitting quietly in the back corner of the sanctuary. And that spring, another flyer went up at the church, and it read, "Volunteer needed to care for Carl's garden." A few days later, there was a knock at the minister's office door, and standing there was a tall young man with tattoos running down both arms, holding that flyer in his hand, and he said, "I think this job is mine, if you'll have me." The minister smiled and handed him the keys to the garden shed and said, "Yeah, go take care of Carl's garden and honor him." And he did. He faithfully took care of the flowers and the vegetables in that garden for several years. And during that time, he went to school and he got a job and he got married and he became active in the community. But he always found time to keep Carl's garden as beautiful as before. But one day he came to the minister and handed him the keys to the garden shed and said, "I'm afraid I won't have time to care for the garden anymore. You see, my wife just had a baby last night and we're bringing him home tomorrow. Little boy." The minister gushed, "Oh, that's wonderful. Congratulations. What are you going to name him?" "Oh, we're going to name him Carl." Given the choice between a life that's fair and a life of grace, I choose the life of grace every time.